Marketer of the Day, number 464. Procrastinators are people too. How to be productive, calm, congruent, anxiety-free, and happy with Dr. Mary Lamia. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. We're going to talk today about procrastination. Our guest today is Dr. Mary Lamia, and Dr. Mary is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst who practices in Marin County, California. We're almost neighbors, and she's the author of 5 books, including a recent publication which is called What Motivates Getting Things Done, Procrastination, Emotions, and Success, and she belongs for Psychology Today, Therapy Today, and Thrive Global websites. So Dr. Mary, glad to be talking to you.
Glad to be talking to you, Robert.
So you said right before we hit the record button, you asked about if I'm a procrastinator and how much I'm a procrastinator. What did you tell me? I'll just let you say it.
I just wanted to know if you understood those people. And you said sometimes you were a procrastinator, some of the times you're not. And I said, when I get finished with you, you'll want to be a procrastinator all the time.
So why is that? Why would I want to be a procrastinator 100% of the time?
Because, well, nobody's really a procrastinator 100% of the time. But overall, contrary to popular belief, I found that procrastination doesn't necessarily interfere with success because those who wait are just as likely to be high achievers as people who complete tasks ahead of time.
So why is that?
Because our emotions motivate everything we do. Our emotions are behind the kind of style we have that motivates us to get things done. For example, it all has to do with when one's emotions are activated and what activates them. Procrastinators are primarily motivated to complete tasks when their emotions are activated by an imminent deadline. They're deadline driven. And in contrast to procrastinators, people who get things done ahead of time, like me, we're task-driven. When we're faced with uncompleted tasks, we're compelled to take action right away. We're motivated by our emotions to complete a task ahead of schedule and put it behind us. And those of us who are successful attend to the quality of our work. It's not just trying to scratch a task off the list, but doing it well. So basically, procrastinators are motivated by deadlines and the emotions that come up when a deadline is looming. And task-driven people are motivated by emotions that come up when they see a task left uncompleted. Unfortunately, those of us who are task-driven have a hard time letting things go. If we walk into the house and we see something that needs to be taken care of, whatever it is, it could be breadcrumbs on the counter, we need to take care of it, or we feel compelled to take care of it. We don't always do so. People who are task-driven learn to quell this urgency to get something done right away. A bill comes in. You don't necessarily have to pay it that day, but task-driven people want to get it off their plate. Whereas a deadline-driven procrastinator can wait until it's closer to the deadline, and then their emotions are activated by the date they have to get something done or the time.
Okay, so
they're really remarkable people. They're remarkable because they're so efficient.
Well, so just to make sure that I'm understanding you so far, so there's task-driven people and there's deadline-driven people, and so what this is making me realize is maybe, if sometimes I'll walk into a room to get something, and then I'll realize, oh shoot, the bed's unmade, or the stuff needs to be put away, and next thing you know, I get all these things done, but I don't do the thing that I went in to do the room initially. And then we'll also think, so that sounds more like that's task driven, right? Like I needed to go and do something and there's other tasks in my way. Okay.
It is, but what's interesting about procrastinators is that if they have a deadline for a project or to get something done, or they want to get something done right now, their emotions are activated. And those emotions enable them to see all kinds of other things that aren't completed. Okay. So it's that they attend to a whole lot of things all at once when a deadline is looming. And a deadline for one thing becomes a deadline for all the other things they haven't done. Now, going into a room and noticing things that haven't been done could be true of either style. It depends whether or not emotions are activated in that process or activated anyway by something else. So it's a very complicated process, and it's not just one or the other, and there's all kinds of things in between. But it's interesting that deadline-driven procrastinators often think that when they're doing all these other things and they have a deadline to do something else, that they are distracted or wasting time or not getting down to the task, when in fact they don't realize that when emotions are activated, emotions motivate us. That's their purpose. Emotions are designed to help us pay attention, and they motivate us to act, to do something. So if we're in a situation where fear is activated, we might back off. Or if we're going on a date with a new romantic interest, we might be motivated to brush our teeth because we fear shame due to bad breath. Emotions motivate us to do something.
So when you're describing these emotions and things, like, I don't know, it sounds like maybe it could be unhealthy if it happens too often, but the way that you're coming out this, it sort of sounds to me like if we previously might have thought that if we're deadline driven that we kind of waste all this time, but maybe we're making better use of our time because we don't focus on things until they're important, and then when they are important, we use our emotions to make sure that we bring our A game and do it quickly and do it well. Is that on the right track?
Well, that's on the right track. And the other thing about deadline-driven procrastinators is their capacity to keep things in short-term memory and working memory. And they're able to mull things over, think about it, let it marinate, and then when they execute, they do it all at once, and they do it very, very well. Their ability to relax or get involved in what we think of as distracting activities prior to a deadline is really important, and it's a fascinating aspect of their style. They organize data in their head, especially for written work, and as they engage in those so-called unproductive activities. Now, if you do that, you're a true deadline-driven procrastinator.
Okay. So, I mean, what's the lesson to be learned here? Is it that maybe people who are procrastinators maybe don't need to completely throw everything out and completely reinvent themselves? Maybe they almost have things dialed in. They just need some maybe fine tuning.
Yes, they need to optimize their motivational style rather than change it. People try to change their motivational style, and there's all kinds of self-help books written on the subject, as you probably know, about beating or overcoming procrastination. And it doesn't work. It just doesn't work because of one basic thing, which is we are a composite of our lifetime of emotional memories. Our emotional memories create our personality and who we have become, our lifetime of them. We aren't always conscious of those memories, of course, but when an emotion is triggered in the present for whatever reason, let's take grief because that's a good example. When an emotion is triggered in the present, like grief, our past history of every time that emotion was triggered informs us unconsciously to how we respond. And so we aren't going to change our lifetime of emotional memories, but we can build, new memories on top of that maybe help us be a little bit different or help us alter our style a bit or how we respond to something. However, we're stuck with our memories. And what I found in highly successful people who procrastinate and those who don't, their style developed around somewhere between fourth grade and seventh grade. If you ask people if they did their homework when they got home from school because it drove them crazy to not have it done and they couldn't go out and play until everything was finished, they're task driven. If they're those kind of people who came home and put everything aside and went out and played and could enjoy themselves and then did it at the last minute but got it done, they're deadline driven. And children develop that style, much to the chagrin of a parent who has another style.
Yeah, I can imagine how someone is set in their ways, or if they think that there's only one way for themselves to do it, and they see how this child, if they're one way or the other, I can imagine how it drives someone crazy. So if someone, so is that the starting point? Is for someone to maybe look at that first and say, am I more deadline driven leaning or more task driven leaning? Would that be a good place for someone to start to understand how they can maybe embrace their inner procrastinator and still get all the things done they need and want to?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that question because that's the number one thing people need to do. And I devote a whole initial chapter to that to help people understand their way of doing things and the way other people in their lives do them so that they don't they don't judge them harshly or criticize people for being different in the way they get things done, but instead take a look at how they do them. Because really, when it boils all down, there are only two criteria for success. However you define success, high achievers never miss deadlines and their work reflects their best efforts, whether or not they procrastinate in the process.
And I imagine that there may be some people who procrastinate, but also miss deadlines and maybe need to get a few things figured out.
Yes. Missing a deadline or failing to do the work adequately who is a problem, but its source has little to do with procrastination. People who fail to meet deadlines or to do the work adequately often blame it on procrastinating, or very commonly blame it on procrastinating. When we think about it, when you repeatedly fail, you experience a lot of shame in your life, the shame of defeat. People will do anything to avoid experiencing shame or acknowledging that they experience shame. So often, and shame motivates us to save face and to somehow restore the connections we've lost. So one of the ways to save face is to call yourself a procrastinator when really you've defeated yourself over and over again.
So, I mean, should we be calling ourselves procrastinators or not?
Should we be calling ourselves procrastinators? If you are a true deadline driven procrastinator who never misses deadlines and does good work, absolutely. Procrastination is a valid motivational style.
Okay, great. So procrastination can just be that we are a procrastinator who also gets things done, and maybe people have maybe used that as a derogatory term, or maybe just said, "Oh well, I can't do XYZ because I'm a procrastinator." Maybe we
Oh, the
should
stigma.
embrace it instead.
That's right. And if you use the term procrastination as an excuse, then maybe you need to look at the other emotional issues that are impeding your success. Being deadline driven does not interfere with success. It may get you criticized by other people who don't understand your style, and that's one of the things I want to change, and I have chapters devoted to that because working relationships and intimate partnerships where people have different styles often lead to conflict because these people don't understand one another.
So as people kind of move through the chapters of your book and they figure out more about themselves and what they need to do, like what sort of things will we be asking ourselves or figuring out, or what sort of actions will we be taking in order to be a better person here?
Well, the book is really a short course on how emotions work and how emotions help us be successful. And if we understand our emotions and can interpret them properly and can take a look at them rather than disregard them or try to push them aside, um, they really help us be successful and move forward in our lives. You know, emotions motivate all of our behaviors and even our beliefs. When we simply look at behavior without exploring the emotions that motivate it, we overlook the significant influences that make for differences among people, like numerous beliefs or convictions, religious practices, political party preferences. are to a large extent the result of an individual's emotional memories that have become linked with an ideology. They're sort of a script that has been written in our implicit memories based on our lifetime of emotions. So the divergent ways in which people complete tasks is no different. But should we judge somebody for having a certain belief system, even a political belief? Because really, it's based on their lifetime of memories that have been linked with the cognitions they associate with it.
Interesting. So a different way of going about it. And so, do you have any interesting case studies or stories to really help us like solidify some of these ideas? Like, do you have a client or someone who kind of came to you and didn't have things figured out, and you set them straight and made things super awesome for them?
Numerous clients who have come to me, and especially those, well, I have task driven ones too who suffer because they can't let go of things. And gradually they have learned to be able to say, this can wait, or I can do it later, or this isn't necessary to do right now. But the deadline driven procrastinators really suffer because there's such a stigma around procrastination and such criticism around it. And I've actually gotten many deadline driven procrastinators to the point where they feel really proud of their style. One gentleman who is highly successful in his work, he was an independent consultant, and he was just soaring, but he chastised himself for procrastinating and felt he could even be more successful if he didn't. Well, I don't know how he could even be more successful than he was, but that was his way of reprimanding himself. And he would talk about how he would send things out 1 minute before the deadline, and how he couldn't work on things beforehand because he didn't have the energy or the motivation, and he thought something was wrong with him because he didn't have the motivation to do it earlier. And so we took a look at that, and it was so obvious that the emotions were not present that enabled him to be motivated. Again, emotions motivate us. But as soon as he was racing the clock, he had very high anxiety and very high shame anxiety, which is cognitively, shame anxiety comes out as having a fear of failure. And a fear of failure is highly motivating for people. People, as I said, will do anything to save face. And he would just get down to work. He was highly focused. He was very efficient. Nothing could interrupt him, and he would always get it done. And so when he understood the emotions that motivated him and what anxiety is, what shame anxiety is, and what really is the pursuit of excellence, and how does that relate to our emotional lives, he became very satisfied with himself and very proud of himself in the way in which he did things.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing here is that maybe if people are, I mean, deadline driven or task driven, the answer isn't necessarily to take any different actions, but maybe to feel better about the actions we take. And if we have that tendency to wait until the very last minute to turn things in, get things done, we don't need to fight that, but we do need to fight maybe the stress and anxiety or maybe the bad stuff that comes along with that.
And redefine what constitutes success. Never missing a deadline, and your work reflects your best efforts. If that's the criteria for success, then it makes it a little easier to evaluate what you do. Success doesn't mean you get it done 2 weeks early. Success means you get it done, and you get it done before the deadline. And if there isn't a deadline, how you create absolute deadlines. And procrastinators, I'd rather call them deadline driven, but I call them procrastinators for the sake of conversation. Deadline driven procrastinators have amazing ways to create absolute deadlines when there are none.
So what does that mean exactly? Does that mean that, like, maybe do some people have the problem of they're a procrastinator, which nothing can be done about that, or they're deadline driven, but maybe they need to set deadlines in the first place, or maybe need to set better deadlines?
Well, what happens is that people assume that deadline-driven people have time management problems, and that when there's an absolute deadline, like you're going to be taking some kind of licensing exam on September 30th, then they can meet them. But then when there are no absolute deadlines, like I want to write a book, then what do? Well, procrastinators have a way of creating an absolute deadlines, and one of their biggest way of creating absolute deadlines is to make a promise to themselves or a promise to somebody else. Making a commitment to another person that you're going to get something done at a particular time, even if it's in casual conversation. You're at a party and you see a colleague and you say, I have a book I want to write, and I want to get it written by next year exactly at this time. Commitment incentives are really, really important to deadline-driven people. I had a dissertation student who finished her dissertation before anybody else in her cohort, and she was one of the most serious procrastinators I've ever known. But what she would do is, I realized she was a procrastinator when I started getting emails from her as her dissertation chair where she would say, by next Wednesday afternoon, I will have this chapter to you. She never failed. But the way she created an absolute deadline was to make a commitment to me. And I didn't care, but she cared about keeping her commitments.
Interesting. So she used you as an accountability partner, and just the act of putting it out there, putting it in front of someone else to see, just by doing that, and motivated her, got whatever emotion stirred up to do what needed to be done.
Deadline-driven people do that all the time, and we don't realize they're doing it. The patient I told you about, he would say things to me like, by next week on Wednesday, I want to do X. And you just throw that out. Well, I didn't care if he did it or not. But that was accountability, absolutely. Even if you imagine it, but see, it's making a commitment to oneself. It's creating an absolute deadline. They do things like they'll use timers. They'll set an alarm to a specific time, like 1 hour, and they'll see how many things they can get done in that time. So they're sort of racing the clock in their own way. Or they'll use extraneous circumstances. They have to be to the airport at 3 o'clock. And so that becomes a false deadline to do all these other things, to get a whole bunch of things done before they leave for the airport. There's all kinds of tricks they use just naturally to get things done.
Super cool. And you're making me think back to different times when I, maybe without even realizing it, when I've played some of those mind games on myself where I had to get certain things done, but I needed to have my bag packed and go to the airport and get on a plane and be somewhere. And for whatever reason, that last day or two before, or especially the last day before hopping off on a trip somewhere, I would sometimes get more done in that one day than the last week or two ahead of time. So I can definitely relate to a lot of those different things of setting the timer, having to get something out of the way before something else really important. So I mean, lots of really good stuff here, and I want to make sure that everyone knows about how to get this book and knows about your websites and how to find out more about you and what you have going on. So can you fill us in on what sort of websites, what sort of places someone should go to after listening to our discussion today?
Well, they can go to my website. My books are on there, marylamia.com, MARYLAMIA.com, or to the website for the book, whatmotivatesgettingthingsdone.com.
Super great. So we will see you guys there and gals on both of those places. What motivates, or what is that? Whatmotivatesgettingthingsdone.com? Is that right?
Yes.
So
What Motivates Getting Things Done, and the book is What Motivates Getting Things Done, Procrastination, Emotions, and Success.
awesome. It sounds like a great concept to use our emotions to help us rather than hurt us. So whatmotivatesgettingthingsdone.com, and then marylamia.com. That's MARYLAMIA.com. And we'll see you there at both of those places so you can check out the great book that Dr. Mary has. And then what other kind of cool stuff will they find on marylamia.com?
They will find books for children on emotions, a book for adolescents and young adults. They'll find a book on rescuing behavior. It's called the White Knight Syndrome. And a book that's coming out specifically for clinicians, however, it's called The Upside of Shame. And there is an upside of shame.
Ooh, is there an easy way to explain that, or do we have to wait until the book comes out for that?
Just as I said earlier, one little secret is that shame motivates us to do things because we want to save face, but shame also motivates us to restore a connection we have lost from what has occurred, from what we feel shame about. Shame is an awesome emotion, and it is hidden in many, many, many clinical syndromes like depression, anxiety, ADHD, personality disorders, and you see it a lot in couples therapy and couples interactions. So it's an important emotion for clinicians to understand, and that's why the book was written.
Well, sounds great. Sounds like a great message and thing that people need to know about. And just what I'm hearing this whole talk of ours is that if we're set up a certain way, it's sort of set in stone. Like you said, a lot of stuff kind of solidifies 4th through 9th grade. So if we are a certain way, if we think and we act a certain way, there's no point in trying to fight our own inner nature or trying to ignore these emotions. Why not use them for positive results as opposed to trying to fight ourselves every which way? So this sounds like great advice everyone needs to hear about. So once again,
to optimize them. And but Robert, before you go,
yeah,
tell me, when did you do your homework as a kid?
I did my homework, I guess when I was at the young age when my parents would yell at me, then I would do it when I got home. And then around high school, when everyone procrastinated a lot, then I would do things right before when there was less parental supervision.
And you're successful.
Yeah, and I think that I went, and then when I went on my own, early college, I was more of a deadline driven. But then later in college, when things seemed to get easier and less stressful, then I moved towards the task driven. That seemed to be a better fit for me. And I would get things out of the way done and get my headspace cleared and get the stress cleared. And it turns out I like that better, but it just took this whole journey to figure out that was better for me.
But wait a minute. You know what? If you have an enormity of commitments and a lot of stress, and you, as you said, you have to get your head cleared and the stress cleared. Stress is the emotion of anxiety. And anxiety is a combination of the basic emotions of fear and distress. So your emotions were activated, and that's why you did it ahead of time.
Interesting. So there's not one right or wrong answer. It's just what activates the right emotions to get what we want.
Yes.
Well, super great. Well, it's great and also scary because we're kind of looking inwards at the same time. But this is making a lot of sense as far as where we are on that scale and what we can do to get things done. So great stuff there. And make sure to check out, once again, whatmotivatesgettingthingsdone.com and then marylamia.com. And we'll see you there. And thanks, Dr. Mary, for giving us some of these insights today.
Thank you, Robert.
Check out the latest episodes of our podcast on the web at marketeroftheday.com. And subscribe to us on iTunes at marketeroftheday.com/iTunes or search the phrase Robert Plank in your iTunes app to find us there.